Good morning, students. Today we have the story that is A Face in the Dark, written by Ruskin Bond. So, before beginning the story, I would like to tell you something about Bond. Ruskin Bond is actually an British descendant in a prolific writer whose works are popularly with adults and children alike. Means he was born in Britain and his father was an army officer in during the time of British reign, and he finally settled in India. He lives still in Missouri and unmarried, and he has written several storybooks for children as well as novels and stories for adults. So he is a very popular figure, and he also won a Nobel Prize for Literature. In the following story, Ruskin Bond relates a thrilling incident set among the picturesque hill around Simla. Ruskin Bond's fascination with the panorama finds expressions in the macabre tale. Mr. Oliver, a school teacher, is on his way back to school late one night when he meets a strange young boy. The encounter fills him with terror and he takes to his heels only to discover that there is no escape from him. Ruskin Bond makes skillful use of all elements of a horror story: fear, surprise, suspense, and mystery to explore humanity's collective fascination with the dark. So, as far as the present story is concerned, there is a supernatural element which is described in the whole story. So, the story A Face in the Dark has a use of supernatural element. Mr. Oliver, the center character in the story, has been described as a man who was not given to nervousness or imagination. That was perhaps the reason that he had been walking through the forest on his way back to school from the Simla Bazaar every night for several years. So let us begin this story and see what happens. A Face in the Dark by Ruskin Bond. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. Outskirts, furthest part. So, Mr. Oliver, who was a school teacher in an Anglo Indian school, was returning from his school, which was situated in the furthest part of the city at one night. From before Kipling's time, the school had been run on English public school lines. So that was the English public school, and it was very famous from famous writer Rudyard Kipling's time, and the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families. The students of the schools were from Indian wealthy families who used to wear blazers, caps, and ties. Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eton of the East. The school was once nicknamed or called as the Eton of the East by Life magazine in one of its Indian special edition. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. Mr. Oliver had been teaching the school for many years. The Simla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school. The main city, the bazaars and restaurants were situated apart from 3 miles from the school. Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, Mr. Oliver, who was a married man, bachelor, usually strolled, means walked slowly into the town in the evening, returning after the dark when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. Returning from the school at the time of evening, Mr. Oliver would usually take a shortcut which passed through the pine forest. So it was his daily routine. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made a sad, eric sound that kept most people to the main road. So, sometime when there was a strong wind, the pine trees would make a strange and frightening sound. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man, but Mr. Oliver never feared nor had any imagination about this. He carried a torch and its light. The batteries were running down. The batteries had been reduced and moved fitfully. Fitfully means for a short period down the narrow forest path. When its flickering light fell in the figure of a boy. Mr. Oliver was returning from the school, so in the reducing light, in the shining unsteady light of the torch, he caught a boy's face. Light fell in the figure of a boy. The figure of the light of the torch fell on a boy's face who was sitting alone on a rock. The boy was sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped and sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped and looking at the boy's face. Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark, and he said that this is not appropriate time to be gone out of the house in such a dark. What are you doing out here, boy? Mr. Oliver asked what the boy was doing there. Asked Mr. Oliver sharply. He asked it loudly, moving close so that he could recognize the miscreant. Miscreant means uh, who has done mischief. So he came closer to the boy so that he can recognize the face of the boy who had the mistake, mischief. But even as they approached, but when he approached near the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. He realized that something has gone wrong. The boy appeared to be crying because the boy was crying. His head hung down, his head was hanging down. He held his face in his hand and he held his both his he held his face in both his hands, and his body shook convulsively, and his body was shaking repeatedly. It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. And it was a strange kind of, it was a peculiar kind of weeping without making a noise, only he was sobbing. And clearly, Mr. Oliver felt uneasy, discomfortable. Well, what's the matter? He asked. He asked, what is matter? His anger giving way to concern. Now his anger converted into a concern, anxiety. What are you crying for? Why are you crying? The boy would not answer or look up. The boy would not answer, nor did he look up. His body continued to be erect with silent sobbing. He was only crying, sobbing. Come on, boy, you should not be here at this hour. Mr. Oliver, consoling the boy, said that, come on, you should not come late hours in this way. Tell me the trouble. What is trouble? What is wrong with you? Tell me. Look up. The boy looked up. He took his hand from his face. He removed his hand from his face and looked up at his teacher. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face. If you should call it face, but it was not a face. It had no eyes because there was no eyes, no nose or no mouth on his face. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap, and it was wearing a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. But the story did not end here. Torch fell from the trembling hands. His torch fell from his hands, which was shaking at that time. He turned and scrambled down the pot. He moved uh, with urgency or panic and running blindly through the streets and calling for help. He called for help. He was still running towards the school and was running towards the school building. when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path, and he saw a lantern was swinging in the middle of the path, Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. The watchman, which was breathing loudly, Mr. Oliver bumped up. Mr. Oliver bumped into the watchman. What it, Sahib? And at this, the watchman called, "What it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been any accident? Is there any accident? Why are you running? And why are you running?" At this, Mr. Oliver said, "I saw something horrible. I saw a horrible sight which made me run, and therefore I am running." Mr. Oliver told this, a boy weeping in the forest, and he had no face. Mr. Oliver told the watchman that a boy who is weeping in the forest had no face, and the reason of my running is that I saw a faceless boy weeping in the forest. No eyes, and the boy had also no eyes, no mouth, and nothing. Do you mean it was like this side? At this, the watchman asked, "Do you mean that the boy is like this?" Of the watchman and raised the lamp to his own face, and he raised the lantern to show his own face. The watchman had no eyes. Similarly, the watchman had also no eyes, no ears, and no features at all. His face was very much alive to the boy whom Mr. Oliver encountered earlier. The watchman's face had the same resemblance, bearing the same likeness with the boy's face, and he also had no nose, no mouth on his face. So not even an eyebrow, and there was no eyebrow on his face, and that's when the wind blew the lamp out. And after some time, the wind, as it was blowing continuously, it blew out the lamp, and it became the complete dark. So the story ends at a strange point, and the story begin in the beginning. Mr. Oliver had seen one face, and now he had seen two faces.